turn now to the main business of the evening, which is to hear from our guest speaker, Hugh Saddler. Hugh has been waiting patiently in a little box there in the corner of my screen. Hugh is an independent consultant. He's an honorary academic. He's been fully engaged in the analysis of major national energy policy issues, not only in Australia, but at some time in the UK as well, as an academic, as a government employee, and as an independent consultant. He's the author of a book on Australian energy policy. He's published over 70 scientific papers, and he also is the author of the quarterly National Energy Emissions Audit for the Australia Institute. The title of Hugh's talk tonight is what is it? It's Solar Gridlock. And Hugh is going to tell us exactly his views on how our electricity is going to be or should be generated and channeled around the countryside where it's needed in the next few years. So I'll hand over to Hugh.
Thank you, Dominic. Well, I mentioned the way I'm going to do this. I have prepared a series of graphs, and I will share them and put them up and talk to them, explaining about how the national electricity market is operating. And then most of what I've prepared is about the various futures that are seen as possible for the national electricity market in the recently released integrated system plan done by the Australian energy market operator. And it's sort of like a guidepost to the to possible futures. And the reason that they do that plan, and this is the second one, they did the first one 2 years ago, is because well, there still isn't really a good process for linking the construction of new generation, mostly solar and wind, and the construction of the mechanisms, that is transmission lines and the other support services needed to get the electricity to the consumers all around the country, all around the eastern half of Australia. And the range of scenarios they present give a very broad range of options of futures we might like and futures we almost certainly wouldn't like in terms of the mix of generation. And I haven't put it's an enormous amount of a great big body of work, but what it comes down to for them is details about new transmission lines and where they should be and when they should be built. Well, I'm not going to talk about that, but I'm just going to more talking about the potential future of generation. So I'll hopefully start sharing my screen and start to the first graph. I hope everyone can see that. The first few graphs I've got are just to explain how the national electricity market works in terms of letting the different generators come in, or how they come in to give the right mix of electricity to supply all the electricity that the consumers want. And this was actually last week. Yes, last week, I think, or the week before. It's got the dates down there. It was last week. And it's a stacked graph, as you can see. And the way I've stacked it is with the fossil. Well, that's brown coal. That's black coal. That's wind. That's gas. That's grid solar farms. That's rooftop solar, and that's hydro. And the top of the hydro line is the amount of electricity which was consumed. And the point about this is just that the different types of generation have different characteristics in terms of the way they can operate. The brown coal is really very inflexible, and if it can, it much prefers to generate just like that. And that is what the conservatives like to call a base load, but as the expression is, sorry, I can't remember the expression, but a base load is not necessarily a good thing to have. It's a very inflexible generation, and but because it's not well suited to going up and down, which is what you need, both because demand goes up and down, but also when you have the wind and the solar, they also go up and down. And that's really, if you like, that's in a nutshell, the problems of transitioning to a new electricity supply system. So then we have the black coal. Well, that goes up and down because it has to match the amount that's required and with the variability of the other forms of generation. And then the other ones. And this gives you the relative sizes on those days. And the other thing it shows you is that in the winter time, there's a very distinct peaks in consumption in the morning and the evening, and it dips down a bit in the middle of the day. And although that may have been somewhat affected by the COVID circumstances and the lockdowns and so on, it's not greatly changed actually, and then it goes down a lot overnight. Now, I've got the same data in the next slide, but this slide is sort of, the sequence of the stack on this slide is roughly the sequence in which the different types of generations can bid into or choose to bid into the market. And I've got all the renewable, the wind and the solar at the bottom, and that's because the way the national electricity market works, it's like any market that is actually operating like the textbooks say, that the marginal bidder into the market will bid in at just to meet the party's his or her variable costs, and then hope when the price goes up to recover the fixed costs. And of course, the thing about renewable electricity is the variable costs are almost zero. So they always bid in the bottom, and there's quite a lot of occasions when they bid in negative actually, to make sure that they're then dispatched and they get into the market. The yellow one is rooftop solar, and that doesn't bid at all. What that does is it reduces the demand for electricity coming from the grid. But in that sense, it changes the shape of the curve of the amount of electricity that the other generators are going to have to supply. So increasingly, it's being treated as along with the other generators, except that it can't be controlled. And one of the changes that's happening through all the rules processes in the NEM and so on is the mechanism for the operator of the system, which is the Australian Energy Market Operator, to have more knowledge about all the rooftop solar that's out there, and knowledge of how it may go up and down according to the clouds that are in the sky on the day and that so forth. So it can, because it needs to be able to know in advance somewhat about how much more electricity is required. And so this is just how the bidding process in the NEM works. The next one is the brown coal, because brown coal in Victoria is actually extremely cheap fuel. It's just you probably may have seen actually, or not in photos, of those great big bucket dredges that sort of shovel the stuff up and put it on a conveyor, go straight into the boilers, very low cost. And the coal's got no other value, you can't export it or anything. So they always bid low, which is why they can always, when they want to supply and they're not broken down, they will always supply. The back coal generators are much more able to load follow, and they have higher variable costs, particularly the ones in New South Wales, because the coal costs more to get out and also has an opportunity cost. That is, some of the coal, if it could actually be sold overseas, or until recently it could either. And then the ones at the top are the gas and the hydro, which because they're what's called dispatchable, that is, they can, on instruction, they can go up or down in the amount required. They're ideal for exactly matching the variations in the load. So that's what reason I put that way down there. These ones, this wind and the solar, the term used is they're not dispatchable because they can't go up and down on command. They can go down, and if they're down, they sometimes can go up, but only if the window's there or the sun's shining. So, but that's everyone. That's what they're called. They're not. The technical term they're called non-dispatchable. And then this is actually showing the amounts on those days. And you can, once again, you see the brown coal fat. The black coal was the biggest one, and then there's varying amounts of wind and pretty regular amounts of solar. There weren't any days that week. Oh, there's this day, which was that was the Thursday. It was obviously cloudy in a lot of areas, so there wasn't so much solar. So that just gives you a feel of how the whole thing operates. And one thing that aspect about the whole bidding process that I'm sure you would have heard or read about is the shift from 30 minutes to 5 minutes trading interval is the term used. The way this the system works at the moment, the AEMO issues what's called dispatch orders to the power station for the next 5 minutes. It says you're going to generate at this much for the next 5 minutes, and then that determines the bid. All the bids determine the price, and the last one, the marginal one, the highest one, sets the price for that 5 minutes. But the trading interval on the price that parties actually pay and get paid is the average of the 6 5-minute prices, and that's led to opportunities for some of the unscrupulous market participants to manipulate their bids, and it also discriminates against the renewable generators, and there's a whole lot of problems. So after much opposition and a very lengthy process which is associated with all this, they're actually going to move to a 5-minute trading interval. Their trading interval matches the dispatch interval, which is there were several basically kind of environmental related organisations who were behind that. I think the Total Environment Centre was, and the Australia Institute, with which I've had a very long association, was also very much involved in that, putting that forward as a rule change, and it's actually going to happen. And now, just quickly, this is one, excuse me. This is a week in early April. In April, and in particularly in spring, September, October, November, is when demand is at its lowest. And you see it's a different shape. You don't have that trough in the middle of the day, because you don't have nearly so much. The peaks in the morning and the evening are mostly to do with heating, and you don't need that at this time of year. And so you just get these dome shapes. And what you particularly are getting now, which you probably also may have read about, is the big hole in the middle for the established generators, because of all the solar generation that comes in the middle. And so even though the load's going that way, the generation from the coal and some of the other ones goes the other way, or the gas and so on. And that's a feature of the spring and autumn conditions. So that's just how the sort of market works at the moment. Now I'm going to turn on to talk about the futures, and I'll probably better go through this fairly quickly. That's the past. So all these graphs that I'm going to put up now are annual totals. They're mostly generation, and some are capacity. That is the size of the amount of generation that could be used for the different technologies. And this is the whole history of the national electricity market, going right back to 2000, and just showing the way we're heading, the transition. I mean, it definitely is happening, as you can see there. There's 2014. The wind started back it actually started back here, but there isn't very good data. About 2004, I think, the first wind farm in South Australia. And the red is the solar farms, and the yellow is the rooftop solar. So what that's been doing has been pushing out coal, black coal, brown coal a lot with the closure of Hazelwood and so on around here. and also pushing out gas a fair bit. So that's a graph that I've compiled and written about. That's the history of the capacity, and I put this one up because the new renewable generations look much bigger on that graph than they did on the previous one, and that's because it's just a characteristic. It's not a defect. It's just a characteristic of which is fully taken account of in terms of the overall cost of generating. That wind and solar generation can't have such what's called a capacity factor. That is the proportion of the electricity they generate relative to what they could generate if they were going flat out the whole time. And that's just a feature of them because of obviously in night time with the solar and because of the variability of the wind generation, but all the costings and everything take account of that. I've also put in there on the other axis, on this axis here, that's the graph of the this was capacity. This was the top graph from the line of the previous graph. So just to show you the shape and the variation. So this is showing you particularly the decline in the brown coal generation and some decline in the black coal. Now this is a very, very quick graph to mention because one of the terms you may come across is difference between what's called as generated electricity and sent out electricity. And that's to do with the characteristic of thermal power stations, and particularly coal power stations, that they use an awful lot of the electricity they generate to run themselves. And that, so a lot, and it's sort of, it's between 5 and 10%, and that's what these little grey bits are. The same goes for the brown coal, which is what these little yellow bits are. And that's just to, well, that comes up in some of the other data, the difference between as generated and sent out. And what matters is the sent out. But for hydro, wind and solar, they hardly use any electricity, so they're almost the same. Right, now, this is the first of the integrated system plan. They have a whole series of scenarios, and this is what they call their central scenario. And basically, of course, what these are all showing is plausible transitions. This transition is, they defined the scenario, which I've got on a slide coming up soon, is basically all current policies in place and nothing else. So they see a gradual decline that coal-fired power stations, the wind and solar do keep growing and forcing out coal, and coal power stations do close. The red line is the expected consumption under that scenario, which goes up a bit. And one of the main things that's pushing it up, but not very fast, is a shift, a take-up of electric cars, and also some shift in residential consumption and other consumption from gas to electric equipment, particularly reverse cycle air conditioner for space heating. But under current policy settings, as I'm sure we all know, it's the Commonwealth government is doing absolutely nothing. In fact, it's almost doing as much as it can to oppose the take-up of electric vehicles, which is one of the larger of their numerous what you might call gross inadequacies and deficiencies, about saying anything that I hope is defamatory. Here are the scenarios on that. I'm not sure whether you can read that. The first one is what they call market forces, whatever they may be in the current dysfunctional market. and federal and state government policies. One of those policies, by the way, which I'd be happy to talk about if anyone wants to when we get to the discussion period, is the building of Snowy 2.0, which I don't think is needed, but anyway, and it's going to cost an awful lot of money. Slower economic growth and emissions reductions for slow, fast, more investment in grid-scale technology. That means wind farms and solar farms. This one, called high DER, is distributed energy resources, is the technical term for rooftop solar, effectively. And that means rooftop solar growing very fast. And step change is both rapid growth of rooftop solar and big, fast investment in wind farms and solar farms, which is what obviously we all hope is going to happen. And the consequence of those, that's the emissions they calculate from those scenarios. And you can see that it falls from about 150 there. It's already down to here, it's a bit under 140. No, we're in the mid 130s now, I think, there, by my calculations. Because I write a monthly newsletter about this stuff through the Australia Institute. This is the step change one, and you can see that emissions come down to a very low level. The slow change, they hardly reduce at all, and that's probably consistent with the government's pathetic 26% reduction under the Paris Agreement, and the electricity only doing 26%, which I'm sure you all know. If the electricity only does 26%, well, they're not going to get 26% over the rest of the economy on the present policy settings, nothing like. So they won't meet the commitment in a true, honest way, only by fiddling the books. But you do get down by 2040 to a very low level under the step change scenario, down to about 12 million tonnes from the starting date up here. That's well, 140 to 135. That's about a bit over 120, between 120 and 130. But you should be aware that currently our emissions are about 530 million tonnes every year. So if nothing happens in the other sectors, and there's nothing happening at the moment, electricity still, we need to do far more than just eliminate emissions in electricity. We'll still be at only about 30% below what we are if nothing happens in the other sectors. So there's a heck of a lot got to be done elsewhere, but the reason the electricity is so important is that it's cheaper and easier and all round better to do it with electricity than the other sectors. The other sectors are mostly harder. Now I'm just going to run through these quickly. This one, the same colours of the same scenarios, and of course you only get low emissions if you've almost got rid of coal, and that's what that's showing. The shape of these lines are pretty much like the emission line. So that's the one, that's the slow change. Heaps of coal still 20 years from now. This one, there's only about two power stations left, I think, probably. Loy Yang B and probably one in Queensland. These are the other side of the coin. These are the different levels of growth of the renewables. There's 3 slides on that. Just quickly, that's wind, and the other ones. That's the slow change, and the other ones in the middle. That's the step change scenario, and you can see that actually they, under their modelling, wind chugs along under all scenarios on the same path until about 2025, and then that's presumably because the step changes when that's when the step change starts happening. Similar like that for grid scale solar, and same sort of thing. That's just the assumptions in their scenario. And that's the rooftop solar, and as per the definitions of the scenarios, the step change and what the high DER are the same, because they've both got more rapid growth of rooftop solar, and then, but also quite rapid growth of the other, less rapid growth under the other scenarios. Oh, now this is just about storage. It's probably, the thing is, when you've got more of the non-dispatchable generation, you're going to need a storage to fill in the gaps. You need something overnight, and then you need possibly something when you have 2 days of thick cloud and rain, and maybe it's not very windy, and storage is the way of doing that. Now, it's for some years now, there've been a number of people who've done models of this, modelling of the grid and what the need for storage is and how much, and of different duration and so on. And AEMO for this process did a lot of modelling as well. And if you don't assume that Snowy 2.0 is going to be built, you don't actually have a need for it. Well, it's not for a very long time. That's what the big step up here, that's Snowy 2.0. And that's total storage. Oh, sorry, that's dispatchable storage. Sorry, that's batteries and pumped hydro. And this is the different scenarios of the storage of behind the meter. That means household and business batteries, which they clearly modest growth until this point here, and that would be an assumption that the batteries get cheaper, so that it's really quite attractive. It becomes as attractive as rooftop solar is now, because batteries aren't so attractive on the current costs. Oh, this is just more about storage. These are the different types of storage. This is a bit technical, but these are the ones. Well, this is pumped hydro. That's Snowy 2.0, which can, what they call deep storage, which can store for multiple days. The pale blue one is ones that are the ones that do it overnight, and batteries are going to. Everyone expects batteries going to get a lot cheaper. Big batteries. There's more and more going in, and batteries can do most of that. Some of that there is the existing pumped hydro, which is there's two main schemes. There's the one Bendila Kangaroo Valley, just south of Sydney, and there's one just outside called Wivenhoe near Brisbane, in the hills near Brisbane. And they've been going for a long time. That's their capacity. They don't get used very often at the moment, hardly at all. Sorry. Oh, that is the, sorry, I've raced through my slides. That is the end of the slides. Sorry, I thought I had a couple more. Anyway, I'm sure I've raced through that a lot, but now I'm very happy to take any queries, talk more about the operation of the NEM or whatever.
Okay, Hugh, look, thank you very much indeed. That's really given us an awful lot of numbers, but a very clear visual picture of the share of the market, of the electricity market at present, and also the predictions of how that's going to change. I'm going to put my hand up to applaud that. And if everybody else can find their button, they might like to do that. Wow. Thanks, somebody's found their button. Meanwhile, a couple of questions have come up, and I'm going to merge my question with one that Angela asked. And you mentioned early on in the piece that gas and hydro were basically the two forms of dispatchable energy. And Angela's question is, do we need more hydro to replace gas? And my question is, can you just, in that context, can you distinguish between pumped hydro, which is basically a storage system, not a generating system, as we all know, and hydro as in damming rivers and so on, or something which is using energy that's actually there and available? So is that a distinction? And you might want to talk about your views upon Snowy 2 a little bit more in that.
Yeah, well, there's a very important distinction. Hydro, which without storage, there's no scope for any significant amount of hydro. It's all been utilised. I'm sure there would still be some people in Tasmania who would say that if they could dam the the Franklin River, they could make a bit more, but not very much. And so all sorts of there's actually just not that much more potential. But pumped hydro is a completely different story, and I'm sure a number of you are aware of the study that people I know at ANU did the first study a couple of years ago, and they continue to work on it. A lot of potential opportunities for smaller pumped hydro schemes, which would be able to store water for enough to generate sort of for a day or two at the size. And there's one that's probably going to be investigated up in the inland from Tamworth, I read about just recently. And the way that works is that you probably mostly all know, you have two storages, one high up and one lower down, and you have you have machines that can actually be both generators and electric motors and turbines and pumps, so according to which way the water's flowing through them. And there are also, I should say, there's a number of there are other proposals besides that one near Tamworth, and there are some in South Australia which are being actively looked at, which would actually use seawater, because there's not much fresh water in South Australia, and where it is, it's very flat. But they would use seawater. There's some at the head of Spencer Gulf. There's some places where there's quite reasonably high land, quite close to the sea, and they would use seawater. And there's various other schemes. So that is definitely a way for storage. There's more debate going on about that now, because as the cost of batteries continues to come down, and a lot of the civil works to build these things is very expensive. What I'd say about a Snowy 2.0 is that there are a whole lot of it's incredibly costly. It's doing a lot of damage to the Kosciuszko National Park while it's being built. And there are serious questions about exactly how much energy it can store and deliver. And these are very complicated, and I won't go into it, but it's more to do with the way it works. For those who know a little bit about the geography of the Snowy Mountains, it's Tantangara Reservoir, which is a snow skim reservoir, which just gets some water from the headwaters of the Murrumbidgee River, and instead of sending it down, letting it go down the Murrumbidgee River and flow down past Canberra and so on, they send it across to Lake Yukonbean, and then it goes down the Tumut River through a whole lot of power stations and back out and joins the Murrumbidgee again, somewhere near downstream from Tumut, somewhere near Gundagai. But that's higher up. And they've got to put a long tunnel west from there to the bottom dam on the Tumut River to the whole series of power stations, which is called Taubingo. At Taubingo, there currently exists Australia's largest pumped hydro scheme, which they always put in all the photos. That's that power station where those 6 big penstocks coming down the slope in parallel, 6 great big pipes. The technical name for them is penstocks. They're pressurised pipes. And they're coming out of the top of the Taubingo Dam down to the power station at the bottom, which can also, 3 of the machines can also pump up. But it's got various limitations. One of the limitations is that the pondage at the bottom is not very big, so that they can't let out a lot of water and generate a lot of energy, because they'll fill up the pondage at the bottom and it'll have to overflow and it'll be lost. And there's also a limitation at the top, because the Taubingo Dam is one of these hydro schemes that the head for the hydro just comes from the height of the dam, It's like that's what the Gordon Dam in Tasmania, if you all know about that. They just built this huge dam and flooded an enormous area, but only the top bit of the water in the dam can be used because all the rest of the water is holding up the top bit so they can get enough head to generate. And that's the same as Taubingo, so it can't hold much.
Okay, Hugh, I've got several more questions coming.
Yes, sorry.
So we can move on to a couple more.
I went into the weeds there, sorry.
No, that's all right. Okay. Annie is asking, she says, you said you wouldn't talk about the grid itself, but we're told that they might slow down the rooftop solar feeding into the grid. And I've heard also a lot of people are getting exercised about the possibility not only that the grid provider might be able to switch off feed in, but also that they might charge you to feed in from your solar rooftop rather than the other way around. Could this?
Yes, yeah. Well, that's the problem. It's, to be strictly technical, it's not really a grid problem. It's a distribution network problem, and where it's basically. It's a legacy. It's sort of legacy problem that all the equipment, the substation transformers that are run by, well, where you are, it's Ausgrid, isn't it?
Yes.
Everything you have is probably sort of in buildings or buried, but the even down to what's called the distribution transformers, and then the little pad mount transformers. All of those things are really only designed for electricity to flow one way through the system, and it's quite expensive to replace them or to make adjustments on. They can't be. You can control them with settings on the what's called transformer taps, but the way they're built, they can't be remotely controlled. So someone's got to go out there and change them. If there's too much electricity in the low voltage side, then that causes problems. And the first manifestation of that is over voltage in the local in your street, which causes some of your neighbours will maybe have their appliances burn out or whatever. Those are the sort of problems. So that's mostly a network problem rather than a grid problem. But it's not to say there's not a serious problem. And I think there's just a lot of thinking about it. I mean, the grid problem is what I think mentioned in passing when I was speaking before, is knowing how much there is. And they've got a process in train to have all that registered so that the operator will know how much is there. But all these problems with the over voltage and the transformers and so on is a sort of different issue. And
okay. A couple more very quick questions, but because I just want to come back to something on the grid before we finish. Somebody is saying, Suzanne is asking, what effect would domestic demand management have? Is there a role for new organisations to stand between retail consumers and supply authorities?
Very good question, because that's another change that's sort of in the works and being talked about, and there is some stuff in the integrated system plan, but I didn't include that. Domestic demand management, or if you like, what's got more potential, sort of commercial industrial demand management, is in some ways a substitute for sort of short to medium term storage, because you're really changing the time at which you use the electricity, and the idea is that you when particularly it's particularly valuable potentially if it was used properly, and parenthetically, it is already being used, but it could be used a lot more on days of really extreme demand, those summer days. So that you just reduce at the very peak and move it to a different time. And the way to do this, particularly at the residential scale, has been well known for more than a decade. That the control of domestic air conditioners and commercial air conditioners, and it can be done with causing hardly any inconvenience and if the equipment is sort of activated and the approvals are given and so on, what they do is turn off the compressor part of your air conditioner, which is what part that uses all the energy, and you still have the fan going, and while the compressor's turned off, say for 5 minutes, there'd still be a lot of coof in the coils that the fan was blowing the air over, and you'd hardly notice the difference. And then in the ideal world, they turn your compressor back on and they turn someone else's off. But it's been incredibly difficult to get that up and going. It is going more on the commercial scale, and some of the big companies that own office buildings and so on are getting into this in quite a serious way. And it's quite, you can make quite a lot of money because they do it when the price goes extremely high, and they get sort of paid for that. And now they're doing a lot of work with the rules to try and generalise that, get more what's called demand side participation.
Okay, to wind up by thanking everybody who's participated tonight, and in particular thanking Hugh for his very informative talk on the grid. Hopefully solar yes, but grid yes, but lock no. As I say, we can't do a round of applause because we won't hear you, but we can stick our thumbs up or click on the reaction button and clap. I'd like to do that. Whilst you're doing that, and before we actually log off, I'd like to remind you that something we've been hoping would happen for years will be happening in 25 minutes on ABC TV. Make sure you watch Craig Rucastle's first of 3-part series, Fight for Planet A. It's a program about action on climate change and what we can do and what the issues are. ABC television tonight in 26 minutes time. So that's your next port of call this evening. Meanwhile, thanks everybody for coming. Thank you, Hugh, for participating, for giving us your wisdom. And we should have a look at your search for Hugh, and you'll find some of the things that he publishes regularly through the Australia Institute and the conversation and so on. That's about it. Thank you very much. Good night, everybody. Because I'd